Ryan Carter's hands trembled as he adjusted his daughter's artwork on the restaurant wall. The 8-year-old's crayon drawing of their family,
is so good.
just the two of them,
I think
seemed
the
to
baby
mock
is
him
really
now.
enjoying this too.
Across the dimly lit steakhouse, his
Don't turn
ex-wife
around, they're
Melissa
watching you.
sat alone, her hand
What?
resting protectively over a
If you
rounded
leave now,
belly
you still have a
that
chance.
hadn't been there 6 months ago. The woman
Tell
who
me
had
the
once
truth,
called
Nate,
him
now.
emotionally unavailable
You're not ready to
was
hear
now
it.
carrying
It's
someone
too late
else's
already.
child, and Ryan felt something crack inside his chest. Samantha, his dinner companion and CEO of their partner company, followed his gaze and whispered, "Do you know her?" But Ryan couldn't speak, because seeing Melissa pregnant should have brought relief, proof that she had moved on. Instead, all he felt was a hollow ache and one burning question. If she was so happy with someone new, why did she look so utterly alone? The salmon was perfectly prepared. The wine was a 1997 Bordeaux that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and Samantha Pierce was exactly the kind of woman Ryan Carter should want. Successful, intelligent, beautiful in that polished Manhattan way that photographs well for business magazines. She was describing her company's expansion into European markets, her voice confident and measured, and Ryan found himself nodding at appropriate intervals while his mind wandered to the crayon drawing his daughter Sophie had given him that morning. "Daddy, you look sad in all your pictures," she had said, adding another yellow sun to the corner of her artwork. "I drew you smiling instead." Ryan had hung it in his office, right next to his MBA from Harvard and the Forbes article that called him the tech mogul who never sleeps. But now, watching Samantha gesture with her wine glass, he wondered if 8-year-olds could see things that adults had trained themselves to ignore. The success, the money, the respect. All of it felt like an elaborate costume he'd forgotten how to take off. "You're distracted tonight," Samantha said, not accusingly, just observing. That was one of the things he appreciated about her.
It is so good.
No drama, no emotional
I think the baby
demands.
is really enjoying this
After
too.
Melissa, drama was the last thing he wanted in his life. Just thinking about the Morrison deal. He lied smoothly. The Morrison deal had been finalized weeks ago, but Samantha didn't need to know that his mind was actually replaying the last conversation he'd had with his ex-wife. It had been outside Sophie's school, brief and polite, the way divorced parents talked when they'd trained themselves to be civil. Melissa had looked thin then, almost fragile, and he'd caught himself wondering if she was eating enough, before remembering that it wasn't his job to worry about her anymore. Now she was pregnant. The timeline meant she'd gotten involved with someone almost immediately after their divorce was finalized. The thought should have stung less after 2 years, but watching her sit alone in a restaurant where he used to take her for their anniversary felt like reopening a wound he'd thought had healed. "The merger projections are conservative," Samantha continued, pulling his attention back to their conversation. "I think we could push the revenue targets higher if we align our strategies properly." Ryan's phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Patterson, Sophie's babysitter. "Sophie wants to know if you're bringing her a dessert. She drew you another picture. This one has 3 people in it. Strange question. Does she know someone named Melissa?" His blood went cold. Sophie had only been 6 when the divorce happened, and they'd worked hard to shield her from the worst of it. She shouldn't remember Melissa, shouldn't be asking about her. Unless... "I'm sorry," Ryan said, standing abruptly. "I need to take this call." He walked toward the back of the restaurant, but not before catching another glimpse of Melissa. She was staring at her water glass, turning it slowly in her hands, and something in her posture reminded him of the night she'd told him she was leaving. The same defeated slump to her shoulders, the same way of holding herself like she was trying to disappear. Outside the restaurant, the October air was sharp against his skin. He called Mrs. Patterson back. "What did Sophie say about Melissa?" he asked without preamble. "She said she saw her at the grocery store yesterday. The woman was crying by the milk section, and Sophie recognized her from an old photo she found in your study. She wanted to say hi, but I didn't know if I should let her. The woman she looked like she was having a rough time. Ryan closed his eyes. Sophie had found their wedding photo. He'd thought he'd
Tell me
hidden
the
all
truth,
of
Nate,
them,
now.
but children were persistent
You're not ready to hear
archaeologists
it.
of their parents'
It's too
past
late already.
lives. And Melissa crying in a grocery store, pregnant and alone. It painted a picture he didn't want to contemplate. "Thank you for calling," he said. "I'll talk to Sophie when I get home." Back inside, Samantha was checking her phone. "Everything okay?" she asked when he sat down. "Fine," he lied again. "Where were we?" But his attention kept drifting back to Melissa's table. She'd ordered something but wasn't eating it, just moving food around her plate like she was going through the motions of a normal evening. The hostess approached her table, probably asking if everything was all right with her meal. And Melissa's smile was so forced it hurt to watch. That's when Ryan noticed the man at the bar. Mid-40s, expensive suit, checking his watch repeatedly. He'd been there when Ryan arrived, and something about his behavior seemed off. He kept glancing toward Melissa's table, but not in the way of someone waiting to join her. More like someone avoiding her. "Earth to Ryan," Samantha said, following his gaze. "Seriously, what's going on? You've been staring across the room all night." He had two choices. Lie again and try to salvage the evening, or tell the truth and risk the kind of conversation he'd spent 2 years avoiding. But watching Melissa sit alone, pregnant and clearly struggling, while some man at the bar acted like she didn't exist, made the choice for him. "That's my ex-wife," he said quietly. "I haven't seen her in 6 months." Samantha's expression shifted, but not in the way he expected. Instead of jealousy or irritation, he saw understanding. "The one Sophie asks about sometimes?" He'd forgotten that Samantha had spent enough time around Sophie to pick up on the little things. The way his daughter would sometimes ask why some kids had 2 parents at school events, or why she couldn't remember having a mom around for Christmas. She's pregnant," Ryan said, stating the obvious because he didn't know how else to process it. "I can see that." Samantha set down her wine glass. "And judging by the way you're looking at her, you're about to do something incredibly complicated." Before Ryan could ask what she meant, the man at the bar stood up. Instead of walking toward Melissa's table, he headed for the exit, pulling out his phone as he went. Ryan caught a fragment of his conversation as he passed their table. "Told you I can't do this anymore, Mel. Find someone else to pay for your mistakes." The words hit Ryan like a physical blow. The man wasn't a stranger. He was the father of Melissa's baby, and he was walking out on her. Right here, right now, in front of a restaurant full of people. Melissa's face went white. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor, then sat back down as if her legs couldn't support her. She was shaking now, her hands pressed flat against the table, and Ryan could see tears starting to form in her eyes. "Go," Samantha said softly. "What?" "Go talk to her. Whatever happened between you two, she doesn't deserve to fall apart alone in public." Ryan stared at Samantha, wondering how he'd missed that she had this kind of compassion hidden under her corporate exterior. "Our dinner. We'll still be here when you get back. If you get back." She smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "Some things are more important than merger strategies, Ryan. Even I know that." He walked across the restaurant on unsteady legs, each step feeling like he was crossing years instead of yards. Melissa didn't notice him approaching until he was standing beside her table. When she looked up, her face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: surprise, embarrassment, pain, and something that might have been relief. "Ryan." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Hi, Mel." The old nickname slipped out before he could stop it. "Are you okay?" It was a stupid question. She was clearly not okay. But she nodded anyway, the automatic response of someone who'd been pretending to be fine for too long. I'm sorry, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand.
It
I know
is
this is
so
awkward.
good.
I didn't know you'd be here.
I think the baby is
Don't
really enjoying
apologize.
this too.
He sat down across from her without being invited, the way he used to when they were married and comfortable with each other's space. Who was that guy? She laughed, but it was hollow. Someone who thought he wanted to be a father until it became real. The words hung between them, loaded with implications Ryan wasn't sure he was ready to unpack. Melissa, pregnant and abandoned, was a scenario that activated every protective instinct he'd spent 2 years trying to bury. She'd hurt him, yes. She'd left him when things got difficult, when his work consumed him and he forgot how to be present in his own life. But seeing her like this, vulnerable and scared, reminded him of the woman he'd fallen in love with before success had made him forget what really mattered. "How far along are you?" he asked. 6 months. She touched her belly self-consciously. It's a girl. A daughter. Melissa was having a daughter with someone else, someone who'd just walked out on both of them. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was raising a daughter alone while his ex-wife was about to face the same challenge. "Have you told Sophie?" Melissa asked suddenly. "About seeing me here?" "She saw you at the grocery store yesterday. Asked Mrs. Patterson about you." Melissa's face crumpled. "I hoped she wouldn't remember me." She found our wedding photo. Kids are relentless when they want to understand something. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history settling between them like a third person at the table. Ryan found himself studying Melissa's face, looking for traces of the woman who used to laugh at his terrible jokes and fall asleep reading in bed beside him. She was still beautiful, but there was a fragility to her now that hadn't been there before, like she'd been worn down by the weight of choices she couldn't take back. "I should go," she said finally. "I don't want to ruin your evening." "You're not ruining anything." The words came out more forcefully than he'd intended. "Melissa, where are you living? Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation he read the answer. She was alone, probably struggling financially, certainly struggling emotionally. The successful artist she'd been when they were married had given way to someone who looked like she was barely keeping her head above water. "I have a place," she said, but it sounded rehearsed. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the exact moment she decided to tell him the truth. "I'm staying at a motel on Route 9, the kind with weekly rates and thin walls." She laughed bitterly. "Not exactly what I pictured when I left you to find myself, but life has a way of humbling your grand plans." Ryan felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of anger he'd carried for 2 years. Whatever mistakes Melissa had made, whatever had driven her to leave their marriage, she was paying for it now in ways that seemed disproportionate to her crimes. "You can't raise a baby in a motel," he said. "I'm working on it. There's a job possibility, and I've been looking at apartments, but everything decent requires first and last month's rent, and—" She stopped herself. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear this." But he did need to hear it, because despite everything that had happened between them, despite the hurt and the anger and the sleepless nights wondering what he'd done wrong, Melissa was about to become a mother. She was carrying a little girl who would need safety and stability and love, and the man who should have been providing those things had just walked out of her life like she was nothing. "What kind of job?" he asked. "Teaching art classes at a community center. It's not much, but it's a start." Art. She was going back to art. When they were married, Melissa had been a rising star in the gallery world, her paintings selling for amounts that impressed even Ryan's business-minded friends. But success had made her anxious, the pressure to create on demand slowly draining the joy from the thing she loved most.
Tell me the truth, Nate,
Toward
now.
the end of their marriage, she'd stopped
You're not ready
painting
to hear it.
altogether,
It's
claiming
too
she
late
had nothing
already.
left to say. You're painting again? Trying to. She touched her belly. Turns out impending motherhood gives you a lot to say, even when you thought you were empty. Ryan thought about Sophie's drawings, the way she attacked blank paper with fearless enthusiasm, never worried about whether the result would be good enough. Maybe there was something about children that reminded adults how to create without fear. I want to help, he said. The words surprised both of them. Melissa's eyes widened, and Ryan realized he'd been thinking it for several minutes without consciously deciding to say it out loud. Ryan, no. I can't ask you to... You're not asking. I'm offering. Why? The question came out sharp, defensive. So you can feel better about yourself. So you can be the bigger person. It was a fair question, and one he wasn't sure he could answer honestly. Why did he want to help the woman who'd broken his heart? Was it guilt over their failed marriage? Concern for an innocent child? Or something more complicated? A thread of connection that 2 years of anger hadn't quite severed? Because Sophie is going to ask about you, he said finally. And I want to be able to tell her that you're okay. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough. Melissa stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her fighting between pride and desperation. Pride was a luxury she probably couldn't afford anymore. What kind of help? She asked quietly. An apartment, a decent one, in a safe neighborhood. Maybe some help with the job situation. I can't take your money, Ryan. Not mine. A foundation loan. My company has a fund for supporting women in the arts. You'd qualify, and you'd pay it back when you're on your feet. He was making this up as he went along, but it sounded plausible. His company did have various charitable foundations, and setting up something specific wouldn't be difficult. More importantly, it would allow Melissa to accept help without feeling like charity. Why would you do this? She asked again, but this time the question sounded different, less defensive, more wondering. Because I loved you once. Because you're going to be someone's mother. Because I know what it's like to raise a child alone. And I wouldn't wish it on anyone without support. Because seeing you cry in a grocery store made my daughter ask questions I don't know how to answer. Because it's the right thing to do, he said instead.
I think the baby is really enjoying this too.
Melissa was quiet for a long time, her hands resting on her belly, probably feeling the baby move. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Okay, she said. Thank you. Ryan felt something ease in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Helping Melissa wouldn't fix their marriage or undo the hurt they'd caused each other, but it might give both of them a chance to be better than they'd been before. I'll have my assistant call you tomorrow with the details, he said, then paused. Melissa? What's her name? The baby. A small smile crossed her face, the first genuine one he'd seen all evening. Grace. I'm going to call her Grace. Ryan nodded, thinking that it was exactly the kind of name Melissa would choose. Hope wrapped in elegance, a wish for something better than what had come before. When he returned to his table, Samantha was signing the check. She looked up as he sat down, and something in her expression told him she'd been watching his conversation with Melissa. How is she? Samantha asked. Scared, alone, about to be a mother. He paused. I'm going to help her get back on her feet. Samantha nodded like she'd expected this. Good. You look like you needed to do something decent tonight. I'm sorry about dinner. This probably isn't what you signed up for when you agreed to go out with me. Actually, Samantha said, standing up and gathering her purse, this is exactly what I signed up for. I've been wondering when I'd get to see the real Ryan Carter, not just the successful businessman. Turns out he's someone who helps his pregnant ex-wife when her baby's father abandons her in a restaurant. She kissed his cheek gently. That's the kind of man worth knowing. As she walked away, Ryan sat alone at their table, watching Melissa gather her things across the room. She moved carefully, like someone who'd learned to protect herself against sudden movements and harsh words. In a few minutes, she'd drive back to her motel room, and he'd drive back to his penthouse apartment, where Sophie was probably asleep, dreaming whatever 8-year-olds dreamed about. But something had shifted tonight, some invisible barrier that had been keeping him locked in place for 2 years. Tomorrow he'd start making calls, setting up the foundation loan, finding Melissa a decent place to live. He'd help her get ready for motherhood, the way no one had helped him, when he suddenly found himself raising Sophie alone. And maybe, if he was lucky, helping Melissa find her way would finally help him find his own.
I think the
3
baby
weeks
is
later,
really enjoying
Ryan
this too.
stood in the doorway of a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn Heights, watching Melissa run her hands along the kitchen counter like she couldn't quite believe it was real. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the gold in her hair, and for a moment she looked like the woman he'd married 7 years ago, before success and failure had carved lines around both their eyes. "The landlord said I can paint the 2nd bedroom any color I want," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "For the nursery." "That's good," Ryan replied, though he was thinking about the conversation he'd had with his lawyer the day before. The foundation loan was legitimate now, paperwork filed and approved, but there were complications Melissa didn't know about yet. Complications that would force him to reveal more than he'd planned. Sophie tugged at his sleeve. He'd brought her along today, partly because she'd been asking about Melissa constantly since that night at the restaurant, and partly because he wanted to see how they interacted. The 8-year-old had been fascinated by the idea of Melissa's baby, asking endless questions about pregnancy and sisters and whether babies could hear music from inside their mothers. "Can I see the baby room?" Sophie asked Melissa shyly. "Of course, sweetheart." Melissa's face lit up in a way that made Ryan's chest tight. She led Sophie down the hallway, pointing out where the crib would go, where she planned to put a rocking chair for late-night feedings. Sophie listened with the serious attention she usually reserved for nature documentaries, nodding at appropriate moments and asking surprisingly sophisticated questions about baby care. Ryan followed them, noting how natural Melissa looked with Sophie, how easily they fell into conversation. It reminded him of the early days of their marriage, when Melissa had talked about wanting children someday, when they'd wandered through baby stores just for fun, picking out impossible things for hypothetical future children. "Daddy, look!" Sophie called out, pointing to the window that faced east. "The baby will be able to see the sunrise every morning." "That's beautiful, honey." He watched as Sophie climbed onto the window seat, pressing her nose against the glass. The apartment was perfect, honestly better than what he'd expected to find in their price range. But perfection came with a cost he hadn't anticipated. "Ryan." Melissa appeared beside him, lowering her voice. "Can we talk? Privately?" They stepped into the living room while Sophie continued her exploration of the nursery. Melissa's expression was serious, and Ryan felt his stomach clench with anticipation. "The rental application required references," she said carefully. "Financial references. When I called the number your assistant gave me,
now.
They transferred me to someone who said they were from your personal
late
office,
already.
not the foundation." Ryan's throat went dry. He'd hoped she wouldn't dig too deeply into the paperwork, but Melissa had always been thorough about details. It was one of the things that had made her such a successful artist before anxiety convinced her she wasn't good enough. "I can explain. You're paying for this yourself, aren't you?" Her voice was quiet, but there was something sharp underneath it. "There is no foundation loan. You're just giving me money and calling it something else so I won't feel like charity." He could lie. Should lie, probably. But looking at Melissa, seeing the way she was holding herself with that careful dignity she'd always had, he realized she deserved the truth. "Yes," he said simply. "Why?" The question came out fierce, almost angry. "Why would you do this? After everything that happened between us, why would you spend your money to help me?" "Because..." He stopped, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound patronizing or self-serving. Because when I saw you that night, alone and scared, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. What? That you're not just my ex-wife. You're not just the person who hurt me. You're Melissa. You're the woman who used to paint until 3 in the morning because you got lost in the colors. You're the person who cried when we watched movies with sad endings, even when you'd seen them before. You're going to be someone's mother, and that little girl deserves to have a mom who isn't drowning. Melissa stared at him, and he could see tears forming in her eyes. I hurt you, Ryan. I left when things got difficult instead of fighting for us. I don't deserve— It's not about what you deserve. The words came out more forcefully than he'd intended. It's about what Grace deserves. And what Sophie deserves too. Sophie. She remembers you, Mel. Not everything, but enough. She's been asking questions I don't know how to answer. About why some kids have moms and she doesn't. About why families sometimes break apart. I realize, Aunt Tamar, that helping you isn't just about Grace. It's about showing Sophie that sometimes people can choose to be kind even when they've been hurt. That families can take different shapes and still work. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken history settling between them. Through the window, Ryan could see the Brooklyn Bridge stretching across the East River, connecting 2 boroughs that had once seemed impossibly far apart. I'll pay you back.
It is so
Melissa
good.
said finally. Every
I think
penny.
the baby is
It
really
might take
enjoying
years,
this
but I'll
too.
pay you back. I know you will. And he did know it. Whatever Melissa's faults, she'd never been someone who didn't honor her debts. But there's something else we need to talk about. Her expression became wary. What? The baby's father. Has he been in contact since that night? Melissa's face darkened. Kevin? No. He made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with me or Grace. He actually sent me a text the next day saying I should consider my options if I couldn't handle things on my own. Ryan felt anger rise in his throat, sharp and immediate. The idea of a man abandoning his pregnant girlfriend, then having the audacity to suggest she should get rid of the baby because his support was inconvenient, made him want to find Kevin and have a very direct conversation about responsibility. Have you considered legal action? Child support? With what money? Besides, I don't want anything from him. If he doesn't want to be Grace's father, then she's better off without him. Melissa touched her belly protectively. I'd rather raise her alone than have her grow up feeling like she was a burden her father resented. Ryan understood that sentiment better than she knew. His own father had been present but emotionally absent, always making it clear that family obligations were interruptions to more important work. It was a pattern Ryan had unconsciously repeated in his marriage until Melissa left, and he realized that all his success meant nothing if he was alone with it. You won't be alone, he said. Raising her, I mean. Sophie and we'd like to be part of her life. If you want. Melissa looked surprised. Ryan, you don't have to. I want to. We want to. Sophie's been talking about Grace like she's already her sister. And honestly, the idea of Grace growing up knowing Sophie, having that connection, it feels right. Before Melissa could respond, Sophie appeared in the doorway, her face bright with excitement. Melissa, I have an idea about the baby room. What if we paint clouds on the ceiling, so Grace can look up and pretend she's flying? Melissa knelt down to Sophie's eye level, her face soft with affection. That's a beautiful idea, sweetheart. Would you help me paint them? Really? Daddy, can I help paint the clouds? Ryan watched his daughter's face light up with purpose and felt something settle in his chest. This was what family could look like. Not the traditional structure he'd grown up with, but something more flexible and generous. Something built on choice
It is so
rather than
good.
obligation.
I think the baby is
course you
really
can
enjoying this too.
He said. We'll make it a project. Over the next hour, they wandered through the apartment, making plans. Sophie suggested colors for the nursery walls and offered to donate some of her old stuffed animals for Grace to play with when she was bigger. Melissa showed them where she planned to set up an easel, explaining that having good light would help her work on the paintings she needed for her first art show in 3 years. "You're having a show?" Ryan asked. "The community center where I'll be teaching wants to feature local artists. It's small, but it's a start." She hesitated. Would you and Sophie like to come to the opening?" "We'd love to," Ryan said, and meant it. He found himself genuinely curious about what Melissa had been creating, what stories her new paintings would tell. As they prepared to leave, Sophie hugged Melissa goodbye, promising to visit again soon. Ryan watched them together and felt a complicated mix of emotions. Happiness that Sophie was connecting with Melissa, sadness for all the years they'd lost, and something that might have been hope for whatever came next. In the car on the way home, Sophie was unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke up from the back seat. "Daddy, is Melissa going to be my stepmom again?" Ryan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "No, sweetheart. Melissa and I aren't married anymore, remember? We're friends now, but that's different. But she's having a baby, and you're helping her. That's what families do." Out of the mouths of babes. Ryan glanced at Sophie in the rearview mirror, marveling at her ability to cut through adult complications and see simple truths. "You're right," he said. "Sometimes families look different than what we expect. Melissa and Grace will be part of our family, but in a new way, a way that works for everyone." Sophie seemed satisfied with this explanation. "Good. I like Melissa. She listens when I talk, and she doesn't tell me my ideas are silly. She's always been good at that," Ryan said quietly. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Ryan sat in his study looking at the wedding photo she'd found weeks earlier. He'd taken it down from its hiding place and put it on his desk, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder of how young they'd both been, how naive about what marriage actually required. The people in that photo had thought love was enough, that good intentions could overcome any obstacle. They'd been wrong, but they hadn't been foolish. They'd just needed to learn that love wasn't a feeling you fell into. It was a choice you made every day, sometimes especially on the days when it was difficult. His phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. "Thank you for today, for everything. Grace kicked for the first time while we were looking at the nursery. I think she approves." Ryan stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "I'm glad. Get some rest." What he didn't say, what he was just beginning to understand himself, was that helping Melissa wasn't just about Grace or Sophie or doing the right thing. It was about becoming the man he wanted to be, the kind of father Sophie could be proud of, the kind of person who chose compassion over resentment, growth over stagnation. Outside his window, the city hummed with late-night energy, millions of people living their complicated lives, making choices that would ripple outward in ways they couldn't predict. Somewhere across the river, Melissa was probably lying in her new bedroom, planning the life she would build for herself and her daughter. And in the room down the hall, Sophie was dreaming of painting clouds on ceiling and teaching babies to draw pictures of families that didn't fit traditional molds, but worked anyway. For the first time in years, Ryan felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, not because life had worked out the way he'd planned, but because he'd learned to build something meaningful from the pieces that remained after everything fell apart. The next morning brought complications Ryan hadn't anticipated. He was reviewing quarterly reports when his assistant knocked on his office door, her expression troubled. "Mr. Carter? There's a man here to see you. He says it's about Melissa Richardson. He seems agitated." Ryan's blood went cold.
Tell me the truth,
There was only one
Nate,
man
now.
connected to Melissa who might show up
You're not
at his
ready to
office,
hear it.
and none of the
too late
reasons for
already.
such a visit were good. "Send him in." Kevin Marshfield was exactly what Ryan had expected. Expensive suit, aggressive posture, the kind of man who was used to intimidating people into giving him what he wanted. He strode into Ryan's office like he owned it, his face flushed with anger. "You're the ex-husband," Kevin said without preamble. "The one who's been playing knight in shining armor." "I'm Ryan Carter. What do you want?" "I want you to stop interfering in my business. Melissa called me yesterday, told me she didn't need my help anymore because her friend was taking care of everything. That friend is you, isn't it? Ryan leaned back in his chair, studying Kevin with the calm he'd learned from years of difficult business negotiations. I don't see how that's your concern. You made it clear you wanted nothing to do with Melissa or the baby. That was before I knew she had a billionaire ex-husband willing to bankroll her new life. Kevin's voice was sharp with something that sounded like jealousy. You think you can just swoop in and steal my family? Your family? Ryan stood up slowly, anger building in his chest. The family you abandoned in a restaurant? The pregnant woman you told to find someone else to pay for her mistakes? Kevin's face reddened. You don't understand the situation. Melissa and I had an agreement. She knew this was temporary. Temporary? Ryan's voice was dangerously quiet. Your daughter is temporary? She's not my daughter. Not anymore. I signed away my rights. The words hit Ryan like a physical blow. You did what? I had my lawyer draw up papers. Melissa signed them last week. Officially, legally, I have no connection to that baby. Which means you don't get to play daddy by proxy. Ryan felt the world tilt sideways. Melissa hadn't mentioned signing any papers, hadn't said anything about Kevin officially abandoning his parental rights. But the implications were staggering. Grace would have no legal father, no official protection if something happened to Melissa. Why are you here, Kevin? If you've legally severed your connection to Melissa and the baby, what do you want from me? Kevin's expression shifted, and for the first time since entering the office, he looked uncertain. I want to make sure you understand what you're getting into. Melissa isn't who you think she is. She's needy, manipulative. She'll drain you dry if you let her. That's not the woman I know. Because you haven't been paying her bills for months, listening to her cry about how hard everything is, dealing with her mood swings and her constant need for reassurance. Kevin's voice was bitter now, tinged with something that might have been regret. I thought I could handle it. Thought having a baby would make her more stable. Instead, it made everything worse. Ryan studied Kevin's face, reading between the lines of his angry words. This wasn't a man who didn't care about Melissa. This was a man who cared too much and didn't know how to handle the responsibility that came with that caring. Someone who'd panicked when pregnancy made their relationship real and permanent. So you ran, Ryan said quietly. Instead of figuring out how to support her, you decided it was easier to convince yourself she was the problem. Don't psychoanalyze me. But Kevin's bluster was losing steam. I'm trying to warn you. Melissa will take everything you give her and ask for more. She'll make you feel guilty if you don't fix every problem in her life. Maybe, Ryan said. Or maybe she just needed someone who wouldn't abandon her when things got difficult. Kevin stared at him for a long moment, his anger gradually giving way to something that looked like exhaustion. You really think you can save her? I'm not trying to save her. I'm trying to help her save herself. Ryan moved to the window, looking out at the city sprawling below. The difference is that I'm not expecting anything in return. She'll disappoint you. They always do. Probably. But that's not really the point, is it? Kevin was quiet for a while, and when Ryan turned back, the other man's aggressive posture had crumbled. He looked younger suddenly, less certain of himself.
Tell me the truth, Nate, now!
Kevin
You're not ready
said
to hear
quietly.
it.
It's too late already.
I really did. But when she told me about the baby, all I could think about was how my life was over. How everything I'd worked for would disappear because I'd have to take care of them. I know that makes me a coward, but I couldn't pretend to be happy about something that terrified me. Being scared doesn't make you a coward. Running away from that fear does. Yeah. Kevin laughed bitterly. My therapist says the same thing. Apparently I have commitment issues stemming from childhood abandonment trauma. Who knew? Despite everything, Ryan felt a flicker of sympathy for the man standing in his office. Kevin wasn't evil, just damaged in ways that made him incapable of rising to the challenge Melissa and Grace represented. "It's not too late," Ryan said. "If you really love her, if you want to be Grace's father, you could fight to undo those papers. Get counseling, figure out how to be the man they need." Kevin shook his head. "It is too late. Melissa will never trust me again, and she shouldn't. I proved to her that I can't be counted on when things get hard." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Take care of them, okay? Whatever my issues are, they don't deserve to suffer for them." After Kevin left, Ryan sat alone in his office for a long time, processing the conversation. The revelation that Kevin had signed away his parental rights changed things in ways he was still trying to understand. Grace would grow up without a father, just like Sophie had. The difference was that Sophie's father had chosen to leave. Grace's father had been abandoned before she was even born. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Melissa. "Ryan, I'm sorry to bother you at work, but I wanted to tell you something. Kevin came by the apartment this morning." Ryan's chest tightened. "Are you okay? Did he threaten you?" "No, nothing like that. He wanted to see the place, to see how I was doing." Melissa's voice was thoughtful. "It was strange. He looked at the nursery we'd been planning, and I think he realized what he was giving up. He started crying." "What did you say to him?" "That I hoped he'd find happiness someday, but that it couldn't be with us. That Grace and I needed people in our lives who wouldn't run when things got difficult." She paused. "He told me he'd signed papers
Tell me the truth,
giving up
Nate,
his
now.
rights to Grace."
You're not ready
I
to
guess I
hear
should
it.
have mentioned that
It's
to you
too late
before.
already.
"It would have been helpful to know," Ryan said gently. "But I understand why you didn't want to talk about it. I keep thinking about what that means for Grace. Growing up knowing her biological father chose not to be part of her life. How do I explain that to her when she's older?" It was a question Ryan had wrestled with regarding Sophie, though in different circumstances. How do you tell a child that one of the people who should love them most had simply chosen not to? "You tell her the truth," he said, "age appropriately, but honestly. You tell her that some people aren't ready to be parents, and that doesn't reflect on the child's worth. You surround her with people who choose to love her, and you make sure she knows that chosen family can be just as strong as biological family." "Chosen family," Melissa repeated softly. "I like that. It makes what we're building sound intentional instead of accidental." "It is intentional. Every choice we make from here forward is a choice to build something better than what we had before." That evening, Ryan came home to find Sophie in the kitchen with Mrs. Patterson, carefully measuring flour into a mixing bowl. "We're making cookies for Melissa," Sophie announced. "Mrs. Patterson said pregnant ladies need extra cookies for energy." "That's very thoughtful, sweetheart." Ryan hung up his coat, watching his daughter work with serious concentration. "What kind of cookies?" "Chocolate chip with sea salt. They're Melissa's favorites. I remember from before, when she lived with us." Ryan felt his throat tighten. Sophie's memories of their marriage were fragmentary, but apparently she'd retained some details that even he had forgotten. Melissa's love of salted chocolate chip cookies was something from their early dating days, when she'd insist on making them from scratch every Sunday morning. "Mrs. Patterson, would it be all right if Sophie and I delivered these together tomorrow?" "Of course. She's been talking about visiting Grace all week." After Mrs. Patterson left and Sophie was in bed, Ryan found himself thinking about the conversation with Kevin, about Melissa's quiet acceptance of single motherhood, about the family they were all creating together. It wasn't what any of them had planned, but it was beginning to feel like something real and sustainable. His phone buzzed with a text from Samantha. "How's your complicated good deed going?" He typed back. "More complicated than expected, but still good. Want to talk about it over dinner tomorrow? As friends this time, I think we both know where we stand romantically." Ryan smiled, appreciating Samantha's directness. Their dinner at the restaurant had clarified things for both of them. She was an excellent business partner and a good person, but they weren't meant to be anything more than that. Dinner sounds great. Thank you for understanding about everything. Understanding what? That you're the kind of man who helps people who need help? That's not a character flaw, Ryan. That's why you're worth knowing. Later that night, as Ryan was turning off the lights, he paused in the doorway of Sophie's room. She was sleeping peacefully, one arm wrapped around the stuffed elephant Melissa had given her years ago. On her nightstand was the drawing she'd made earlier that week, the one Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, showing 3 people. Looking at it now, Ryan could see that one of the figures was clearly pregnant, and all 3 were holding hands. Sophie had been drawing their new reality before any of the adults had figured out what it looked like. Maybe children were better at recognizing love in unconventional packages, better at seeing families as they could be, rather than as they were supposed to be. Tomorrow, he and Sophie would deliver cookies to Melissa and Grace. They'd probably end up staying for dinner, helping to plan the nursery, talking about Melissa's upcoming art show. It wasn't the life Ryan had imagined for himself 3 months ago, but it was beginning to feel like the life he was meant to have. Sometimes the best families were the ones you chose to build from the pieces of your broken expectations. Sometimes love looked like forgiveness, help looked like friendship, and healing looked like deciding to trust each other with your imperfect, hopeful hearts.